Good afternoon. My name is Justin Quasla, and I'd like to welcome you to the Union of Concerned Scientists March Science Network webinar, Integration of Social Justice into Science. My name is Justin Quasla, the Science Network Outreach Specialist, and I'll be moderating the webinar for you today. Now, for those of you who are new to the organization, the Science Network is a community of over 200,000 scientists, engineers, public health professionals, and economists who are using their expertise to influence our decision makers. In order to do that, the Science Network provides opportunities for technical experts to advocate for the issues that you care about. In addition, the Science Network also provides resources to help you hone your advocacy skills, such as this webinar. And the Science Network just doesn't advocate in D.C. on the federal level. With offices in Cambridge, Washington, Chicago, and Oakland, we have opportunities for scientists across the country to get involved. Now, today's webinar will focus on the complex and loaded history of science and social justice. While science has led to many advancements that have pushed humanity forward, it has also disenfranchised and ignored large swaths of people due to bias and prejudice. As the Science Network and the Union of Concerned Scientists become more conscious on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we want to host this webinar featuring our partners about how to integrate social justice into the issues we work on. We believe that including issues of race, gender, sexuality into scientific research can supplement and enhance the narrative your data creates. In order to do this, we have invited 3 of our partners to explain these connections and answer your questions. This is their webinar, and we at UCS do not consider ourselves experts in this field. We're here to listen and learn, just like you are. With that being said, let me introduce our presenters. First is Navina Khanna, who is director of the HEAL Food Alliance. HEAL stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor. HEAL is a national cross-sector food and farm justice coalition that has worked directly with UCS's Food and Environment Program. Yvette Arellano is the research fellow of the Texas Environmental Justice and Advocacy Services, also known as TEJAS. Their goal is to promote environmental protection through education, policy development, community awareness, and legal action. They believe regardless of race or income, everyone is entitled to live in a clean environment. And finally, Michele Roberts is the co-director of the Environmental Justice and Health Alliance for Chemical and Policy Reform. EJHA organizes direct engagement and industry reform strategies by grassroots organizations and frontline communities to promote environmental justice outcomes. Both Yvette and Michele have partnered with UCS's Center for Science and Democracy. So we thank all for their time, and without further ado, let's start with Navina. Navina, please take it away.
Cool. Thanks for having me here, Justin and UCS. And I just also want to say, now more than ever that professionals and people from all walks of life are really thinking about this question of how to take more action and to talk more about the need for racial justice in all of our work. So I'm really glad that so many of you have joined this webinar and have dedicated an hour of your day to have this conversation today. And that, we know that there's a lot more to cover than we can cover in the course of an hour, and I'm hoping that this is just, one phase of a conversation that you all will continue to have amongst yourselves about how to do that and how to support each other in the process of integrating social justice into your science work. To start off, I will just say that we know that the reality is that it's really hard, right? That there are real challenges to making change, especially at a lot of the bigger academic institutions and big organizations, to try to integrate social justice into institutions that are not really designed for that. And that it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of persistence to make that happen. And that the transition that we need to get to more racial justice, better outcomes for everyone, is not currently politically feasible, right? We all need to work to change the conditions and the structures. So I did my master's research at UC Davis and worked to develop social justice and sustainable agriculture curriculum at a land-grant university there. And it took dozens of committee meetings and years of student advocacy. I think it was a total of 9 years before we actually got something on the books in terms of creating curriculum and a major around sustainable agriculture and food systems that really integrated social justice into that approach. So just a reminder that it's we all know that it's a long, hard, slow process, and that persistence matters in doing that. And at HEAL, we think about that change in our political landscape as something that we all need to be moving more towards by really investing in creating what we really need and exposing the things that are really bad for us. And this can be taken to the research that you're doing, it can be taken to political advocacy, it can be taken to the ways that you organize, but thinking about how we actually move towards the systems that we want to run, that we want to govern, that actually work for all people and for the planet, requires us to think about that. So just thinking about how you approach science, I think one of the key things to think about is who's an expert. And as Justin mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, one of the goals of the Science Network is to be able to really allow scientists to be advocates and to position scientists to be advocates. And it's really important for all of you to be able to use your own expertise to advocate for the things that we really need, that your voices are considered very credible in our current landscape. And at the same time, the solutions that you're proposing need to be grounded in the realities that are being faced by people on the ground. So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach this, right? Like, for example, bringing in a community leader as a guest lecturer to a class that you're teaching is one simple way to do that. But also in terms of thinking about the research that you're doing and how to understand that, turning to impacted communities to be able to understand what they're facing and what actually needs to be studied is going to be really important. So we believe, and I think the other folks on this webinar will also speak to this, that those who are at the forefront of the impacts of the negativities in our current systems are also the ones who are at the forefront of solutions, and that they have the answers for many of the things. So for example, I'm based here in Oakland, and in the Central Valley of California, we know that there's all kinds of climate impacts and water impacts and environmental justice issues happening that the farm worker community can share a lot about because they face personal experience around that. And they can probably inform the kinds of research that scientists are doing in order to ensure that that research actually helps them with their arguments to try to shift what's happening with pesticides or environmental toxicity. And they might need you sometimes to come to, for example, the water board meeting to advocate for the kinds of changes that they need and to be able to use the research and the data to back up what they're saying. So turning to this frontline community matters. Similarly, ensuring that what gets studied is actually being studied with an intersectional approach, and that as scientists that you're taking a participatory approach to the research that you're doing. And again, I think other folks will speak to this, but really asking communities what they need and inviting them, including them in all aspects of the research design, the process, and the result distribution is going to be important. So for example, if you're thinking about medical research and adherence to medications, that might be more challenging for a low-income single mom to do with the ways that things are set up structurally for her. So thinking about the kinds of research that you're doing with an intersectional approach, taking into account gender issues, income, race, geography, where people are located, it's going to be important in how you design your research, and you'll get the best design by actually including those communities in how you're looking at it. So just to draw out an example of how we think about this, HEAL focuses on food systems and food systems change. And if we look at how it plays out in our society as a whole, one of the easiest things for people to look to is obesity and diabetes and how that's showing up. But of course, if we dig a little bit deeper in the iceberg, we see that there is inadequate access to real food in most communities, and there's what food is available often has to be unaffordable, and it's unaffordable because of low wages and unemployment. And that's largely because there's a concentration of wealth and resources in the hands of a few, and there's systemic prioritization of profit over people and the planet. And if we dig a little bit deeper into who is being marginalized and who is being most impacted, we can see historical and current racism and patriarchy and homophobia and how they play out in terms of what people have access to and what they don't. So being able to think about this whole lens and view in how research gets designed and what research gets done is going to be important. A couple of examples of ways that UCS has used their scientific knowledge to help us out in terms of the ways that we think about the work. Just one quick example, and I'll speak to is at HEAL, we're organizing to get good food purchasing policy passed in multiple cities around the country. And one of the things that, it's been successful. We've gotten it passed in LA with the Oakland School District, with the San Francisco School District. But one of the things that we haven't had the data for is to show the benefits to a local economy or the benefits to local farmers or the benefits to the health of people if we're able to get a policy passed that ensures that municipalities are investing their dollars in food that's good for people. So UCS has taken it on over the course of this year to actually do that study, do that economic analysis for us and provide the data so that we can make the case better for the work that we're doing in communities to get this kind of policy passed that has benefits for people across the board. And so that's one way that we're trying to invest in the good things that folks are doing and create more and more of those things. And at the same time, we're trying to make the case for divesting from the bad things. So another example of what UCS is doing in conjunction with us is working on exposing political ties and the political influence of entities like the American Farm Bureau or others, and using data and economic analysis and scientific research to show the negative impacts of what's happening there so that we can make the case and move away from those things. So turning to communities and seeing what they're actually working on and what they actually need can help with that. One other point I just want to make is around the funding of research. So one thing that we're acutely aware of is that a lot of public institutions and a lot of big institutions are tied to corporate funding, and that's because it's really hard to get public research dollars at this point. So it's important to disclose those kinds of ties to any community that you're working with or any organization that you're working with. That's one piece of the funding pie. And then the other thing is when you're researching a community or researching with a community, to think about how you can actually compensate people for their time and for their work. So one small way is thinking about the time that you're asking people to take to show up to a meeting or show up to a focus group, or if you're asking them to take you on a tour of their community, it's actually compensating for them for that time financially. And to remember that community-based organizations and community leaders are often stretched really thin. There's a lot of issues that are going on in communities, and to support that in whatever ways are possible, including when you're going in for a research proposal, to include them in co-writing that research proposal and ensuring that there's funding for everyone involved in that. The final thing that I'll say is that scientists, once again, have a really critical voice to play in the kinds of change that we're all trying to make, and that we know that it takes all of us. So it takes the work on the ground, it takes the work that's being done in communities, the advocacy, and it takes the research to make it happen. And that if we are going to make the kind of transformation that all of us really want, then all of us need to be able to use our positions, use our diverse skills, our resources, our relationships, our bases, to be able to make that change. And so, again, really, really happy to be in this conversation with all of you. At HEAL, we think about aligning folks across the food system, all kinds of experts who are involved in creating our food system, making it happen, including those who are health professionals and science experts and can bring that expertise to the table to be able to build our political power to make the change. I included one slide in here that just gives a quick snapshot of HEAL and the ways that we approach our work. And I'll just very quickly, because I want to turn it over to the other presenters, say that the three approaches that we take are around trying to build strong political leadership, trying to address corporate control over our systems and get to a place where we have clean corporations, and focus on lifting up, amplifying, and supporting community-based coalitions who are trying to make change in their own communities. So you'll see a couple of examples here on this slide. And I can talk more about it during the Q&A or as a follow-up to this conversation, but I do want to turn it over to the next presenter.
All right, thank you, Navina. Next is Yvette. Yvette, would you like to go?
Sure. Great. All right. So I'm going to talk about mainly our collaboration with UCS and how it's been so different from other collaborations. What we've had is a just relationship with our first major network, and not only that, but scientists and academics, which is something that was very new to our community because we've been so used to being treated a certain way. So this was definitely a positive experience, and I'll give you an example of what some of our previous collaborations, which, mind you, anybody who decides to do research within the community or offer resources and information is always valued. There's a difference between putting together a report and then following that up with policy change and continued interactions with the community versus producing a product and then leaving or moving on to the next big thing. So in this image, you have two examples of what, of what disseminating the information can look like. So on the right, you have an example of two, in fact, collaborations that we've had in the past, very fruitful, wonderful. They've brought us information, but you can see out to the right that the information isn't, the community can't speak to it. The community can't translate it, and the community can't teach itself over and over again what this information is. In fact, we had a very difficult time even translating this information. So the table to the top is actually a report that was used in a UCS study, which we reflected with UCS. Here's some valuable information, but we have no idea what's going on. So you see this extremely technical language that hasn't been translated in a way to go ahead and set up workshops and for us to teach over and over again, or even to train people in the community to go ahead and hold other meetings with it. So on the top right-hand corner, what you see is the outcome of the BTEX report, which studied different toxic exposures to the community of Manchester. And it's pretty convoluted. It's technical. It is a visual, and over again, we try to push our academic and scientific community to use visuals in order to explain this to the community. But, complicated, convoluted, technical, and not able to speak to the community. On the bottom-hand corner, you see something that's a little more, we know arsenic and barium. Well, you look at that chart, and the first thing that stands out is something like lead. Everyone is very familiar with lead, which was, is something that you don't have to translate. But the other metals that were found in the standing water study with Texas A&M, it's a little more difficult, again, to go ahead and hand over this information to the community and have them make some meaningful, sense out of any of it along with the numbers. Now over to the left-hand side, you see some of the products that UCS helped put out. One of the main things we asked of them was after the toxic fact sheet that we created jointly and Double Jeopardy, the Double Jeopardy report, were these infographics. So you have the visual of a woman and a baby, which is, these are our communities, there are families, there are children, there are neighbors, something that the community could resonate to, and then the explanation of some of the toxic exposures and what those impacts really mean. What does it mean to be exposed to benzene, or any one of these chemicals? Well, the irritation of eyes, nose, and throat, and so on and so forth. But you have this visual, and it's an effective use of visual aids versus on the opposite side, still a visual aid, very technical. Only another person in the academic community in that field could really understand that versus the opposite side. And even below that was a PowerPoint presentation that we put together because we were given information that made sense not only to the academic community and the science community, but also to us as grassroots organizers. We were able to put together a PowerPoint and then take that imaging even further. So on the bottom you have the explanation of benzene not only in English but in Spanish. So to the right-hand side, it is valuable information. There's no language justice, so it's not translated into Spanish. That's something that we have to do in-house, and that it takes time and resources. So even after a product is produced, we have to take it in, and that's time that we're not spending on another issue area. That's time we're not spending communicating with the community. That's time where we're not setting up workshops. That's time where we're not doing a demonstration that needs to be done, you know. So on the bottom you have the visual aids, because not only do the communities lack language justice, so it being translated not only in English or understandable English, but then Spanish, we also struggle with high rates of illiteracy. And so those visual aids take it one step further. You're understanding not only that the community is low resource, but there's a low education that we have to address. So the input from at least TEJAS with UCS was, these are the issues in the community. This is gaining an understanding of our previous relationships with the academic community, which, again, produced fruitful results for us. But, you know, you're only able to remember X amount of information, and it wasn't digestible. So through those first conversations, it was, what is your existing relationship with the academic community? What are your needs? What do you see as a priority? And again, that was having information that is able to be understood, information that we can pass on over and over again, the translation piece, which was huge, and the use of visual aids. Can I go to the next slide? Okay. Now, after the product was done, the question is, how do we disseminate? How do we get people to come into the community? We've tried everything from Facebook to Nextdoor to listservs, but at the end of the day, what you have to realize is not only are the communities already marginalized, but low resources, which means going all the way back to doing things like mail-outs, flyers, and canvassing. So offering some sort of budget to, and this was our first major bulk mail-out in the community, of a postcard. And the postcard was simple. It had one of the visual aids that UCS provided us with. So, and below that, it had the information on the meeting. Very simple. This is what we're going to cover. Here are the two groups that are involved in it. A small phrase in Spanish, and on the back, just go ahead and a general meeting invitation. This brought out more people from the community than any other meeting we ever had. And it was because it brought out populations that don't have internet, populations that still rely on newspapers and postcards like this one, flyers, door-to-door canvassing. So not only offering the information that's digestible, but also a resource to get to them. With UCS, they were able to actually fund my position with TEJAS and increase the capacity. So not only was it working on this report, but also recruiting volunteers for the organization, recruiting and reaching out and disseminating the information not only to the community, but to other universities and schools who ended up helping us do the door-to-door canvassing and spreading the flyers along with this postcard that was done through bulk mail-out. Restorative relationships are huge in the entire environmental justice community. Creating relationships that are long-lasting and fruitful is based on also restoring relationships that have been hurt or where there's trauma been present in the past. So before you, there's a snippet of an article that was released. And the snippet actually talks on two things. So if you look at the first phrase, is one of the folks, again, who produced some meaningful information. I would have brought someone to translate, but honestly it's not easy to find someone who knows enough science and Spanish to make these concepts make sense. So, and that's true for everyone. It's hard to find translation opportunities, but they exist, especially if you're working with a grassroots community like TEJAS, who serves a Spanish-speaking population, we have those resources, or we know folks who are willing to offer translation services, and also to help with the translating out of the technical terms, because even when you translate to English in an understandable way, phrases are different, wording is different. So if this body that has X amount of resources, which is significantly more than a grassroots organization, is having a hard time finding someone who can translate, there was an opportunity there that was missed. And the opportunity was, one, making that research that was supplied to us open and available to the community, right? And there was a miscommunication that could have been resolved easily rather than after the fact, right? So in the following two snippets, you see that this person continued trying to communicate with the organization and failed to do so because there was now this bridge. There was this bridge that had been attempting to be built and didn't get successfully there because there was an unjust relationship going on. Not only that, but, you know, when you put things out in public like this, the only thing you're doing is hurting your grassroots organization and further damaging any relationships that that organization has to build with future academics. So in the following piece, you have, did we really need another study to tell us what we already know? It hasn't changed anything. When the research does something to push new policies and regulations that will finally come out, right? Again, so this is pushing science beyond what it is used to doing, which is producing that report, which is, you know, coming out and maybe having a press release or two. But it's asking science to take it one step further. What is the solution? Here, we know that there's a problem. It's not to say that, the grassroots community knows that the problem is X amount of exposures to benzene, but acknowledges that there is a problem with toxic exposures. Now, what is the solution? What does science have to offer in the way of a solution, in the way of a policy, in the way of a recommendation, and is it willing to support us in that? Because science is so used to, our scientific and academic bodies are used to pointing out problems, but not solutions. So in pointing out problems and not solutions, I did want to say a piece about policies that are constructed around some of these reports. It's important to take into account that policies tend to lead to solutions that don't necessarily solve the problem, but shift the solution. There are many reports out there that say that a transitional fuel would be LNG. And what LNG does is shift a burden into the Gulf Coast that will be impacted by X amount of terminals created for that. So taking into account the environment, the setting, the people you're speaking to, and what any solution is to come out. Does it affect another community? Does it shift the burden? Because that would only shift the burden from one environmental justice community to another. So the importance of uplifting the most vulnerable populations is that you're talking about people's lives. So often in academic bodies you see the question of being objective and subjective, and folks try to, really remove the emotions, remove the personal stories. But environmental justice communities and grassroots organizations cannot do that. We cannot subtract one from the other because this affects our daily lives. There is no question we don't have the privilege of saying, can we be objective about this? And so when our communities decide to do things like a toxic tour, take that opportunity. Give yourself an opportunity to not be an expert and participate in something like a toxic tour given by the community that you're trying to understand, because just like Navina said, it's important to not be an expert sometimes and allow someone else to have that specialty so that you get a well-rounded picture of the issues they have to deal with and how it impacts our communities in a very personal way, because you have to get an idea of what the whole picture is, and then you can solve the puzzle, or you can attempt to put the puzzle together by yourself. But know that communication is important. Know that uplifting the most vulnerable populations at the end of the day really helps uplift the entire community as a whole. And by the community, I mean everyone. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Yvette. And finally, Michele Roberts. Michele, would you like to go?
Hi, thank you, everyone, and thank you to my fellow panelists. This is a pleasure being here with all of you on this particular webinar, and where it serves me great joy to participate in something like this. As you said, I'm the Environmental Justice, the co-coordinator of the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. But I also want to begin by saying that my story began in my community I am actually a scientist, and I'm a scientist who grew up in a community and in a time when I was told in school, around school, and what have you, that there were, and the same story exists today. There are no blacks in science, right? And so also understanding that there were black and brown people who contributed to the sciences, but when I say contributed to the sciences in ways such that it uplifted our culture and our lives and our health, when I think of folks like Charles Drew and Daniel Hale and others, right? And our women scientists who were the ones behind that whole moon exploration, if you will. And so I had the privilege, unlike some would believe, of growing up understanding and knowing of some of these folks, and then going on, having the privilege of going on to a historically black college and university, because, again, as this person interested in perhaps science and political science, was not accepted into that particular thought process in mainstream universities at that particular time. Meanwhile, my Uncle Charlie, who was the epitome of my life, if you will, and who taught me everything I know about social consciousness and political science, if you will, had everything of that of a sixth grade education, who actually wound up to be one of those sanitation workers. I am a man, if you will, working under segregated conditions in and around Wilmington, the port of Wilmington. And here's this slide, if you will, that shows the port, as you heard Yvette speak to, the port of Houston. The port of Wilmington is small in comparison, but what people need to understand is that tiny port of Wilmington was the gateway to that of the chemical and banking powers of the world, that being the DuPont company, therefore Monsanto, Dow, and others. When you come through and look at my community, there was a highway that went through a community, and even down to wanting to take the interstate through the community, a community where there were high rates of sudden infant death syndrome and high rates of asthma, known asthma, and what have you, but yet still there was data that was skewed that was actually going to force a highway through there. At that particular time, I was working as an environmental scientist. This was in the late 80s, early 90s, when a community leader came to me and said, we heard that they're going to move the highway through our community just for a moment while they do construction on 495 at that particular time, interstate in Wilmington, Delaware. I took this woman with me to a Title V permit hearing. You better be careful of what you ask for, as they say, using science, social science, and consciousness together. As I opened the door for this woman to attend the Title V hearing with me so she could understand and learn, as you heard what Yvette was talking about, the density and all that you need to know to prove your case. This woman goes with, attends a space with me, and I come back and was reprimanded when folks found out that I took a community member in a government vehicle to a government learning experience to learn how to challenge the government, only to find out later that someone within the government skewed the data. That was going to take a highway through a community that had high rates of SIDS and asthma. My Uncle Charlie actually, by the way, died of a brain tumor. His wife died, next slide, if you will, of urethral cancer. When you look at this next slide, you will see, as you heard Yvette say, Cancer Alley. This is the Gulf Coast. This is what's happening along the Gulf Coast as we're losing our land, our culture, and what have you to the high rates of asthma and cancers and displacement because of big oil, big energy, and data and science that we see that's skewed against us. When the environmental justice movement was created, because of the fact that if you look at the next slide, many people like me were losing their families to cancers and what have you, in those pieces they sought to form relationships based on principles and created principles that needed to be done in order for it to needed to be enforced, if you will, in order for us to move this movement of justice, if you will, through this. Several years ago, Richard Moore, National Co-Director, along with myself, a coordinator for the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, and I sat down after an interesting meeting that I happened to participate in and was approached by then Andrew Rosenberg of the UCS, one of UCS is out of the Center for Science and Democracy. And we began a series of discussions that took us well over 18 months to 2 years that led into what you heard as Yvette so poignantly laid out, the principled relationship between TEJAS and UCS, and hence other principled relationships amongst other affiliate members of EJHA, like TEJAS is, of building these relationships of the need to be supportive of technical assistance and even down to that of support in communities that's rooted and grounded in communities like folks like Yvette who are actually being supported to do the work, not asked to volunteer, but supported to do the work. And those folks are coming from the communities. Folks like myself who years before, several years ago, if you will, grew up as a scientist, and so therefore we don't know about the scientists we're even birthing in our communities, but understanding the fact that in these relational builds, we're actually also altering and changing the face of science, because when you go to the next slide, the big challenge is that of our capital market that's married to our policies that actually force the ways in which permits are created that allow the next slide for folks like the people living near the Houston Ship Channel to be at risk because certain populations are at risk. But it takes scientists, when you look at the next slide, and Annie Aloha up in Alaska, who actually stood for what she believed in. She too had cancer and is now deceased, but yet we are working with UCS and others up in that community. If you go to the next slide, down here in the Kelly Air Force Base where folks are cleaning up, understanding in the next slide on when we look at now the resurgence of the need for big energy extraction, but understanding that cultural practices matter. And so, therefore, we must understand that science is to support the narrative of these communities so that, again, we go to this next slide looking at the rights of water to clean water and those honoring the rights of clean water in the TEJAS colonias and children who are residing next to schools or going to schools next to high-risk facilities where these communities are supported by mechanisms that UCS has partnered with us on as we continue on through to partnering with us on who's in danger, race, poverty, and chemical disasters, which was the forerunner to these reports now that you hear TEJAS, communities like the concerned residents of environmental justice in Delaware, folks in our community partners in New Mexico and California, where we're actually, and TEJAS, when we're working on the Campaign for Healthier Solutions, a dollar store report where science like UCS is providing that demographic analysis, that support that we need, that supports our solutions, because as I say, you people come with no solutions, some of our communities. But what they don't understand, like Yvette was saying and the sister before, we have the science and the knowledge within our communities. They force this narrative to say we're vulnerable, we're resilient. No, we are built and girded with the strength and the technology and the understanding because of the fact that, as they say, we have to understand that culture and the systemic racism and colonization values that were placed on this country must be demystified through that of the science, because science actually was a healthy piece. Right? As we learned, as I went back to Dr. Daniel Hale Williams and others who used it as a healthy, holistic piece, that of W.E.B. Du Bois, understanding the fact that we must look at how we utilize social science and the sciences together to be transformative, to provide that of the redemption that folks need in order to bring justice to their communities. Because if we are operating through a lens that says it's okay for a certain amount of people to be at risk, it's okay for people to live in food apartheid, it's okay, and we're finding out that we see that there are endocrine disruptors within these bisphenol A products and what have you, then we must be supportive of communities asking for that of cumulative risk models, asking for that of making sure that there is no destructive extraction and what have you, and they're living fence line. Why should people live fence line to certain spaces, as Yvette was saying? And so therefore the science must actually have the moral conscience and compassion to stand with communities and support that through the narrative, not making them the guinea pigs per se, as folks were saying, but understanding that this must support the solutions that they are calling for. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Michele. At this point, what we're going to do, is we're going to ask you to start submitting questions for our question and answer portion, which we'll have right after this. But before this, we're going to highlight some opportunities for you to get involved with the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, first of all, if you're interested in learning more about community partnerships, please let us know in the upcoming survey about if you want to try out our Scientist Community Partnership Guide, which covers many of the topics we'll discuss today and provide some additional resources. In addition, if you want to share your story with us, we're always looking for opportunities to highlight our members' voices and the work we do every day. That includes opportunities like our blog, our reports, and also our UCS podcast that launched last month. At the end of April, we're going to have a couple of large marches that we'd like for you to get involved with. The first one is the March for Science, which takes place April 22nd, and we're encouraging you to go to that local march, in your area. And then also we have the People's Climate March the very next week on the 29th that we're encouraging people and our membership to come down to Washington, D.C. for, as we'll be hosting a couple of trainings and also have some social events for the scientists coming down for that. And then finally, if you're interested in getting more involved with just general science network activities, we encourage you to come to be a watchdog scientist. These are the frontline experts who we are contacting to rapidly respond to any bills and regulations in Washington that's going to put public health and safety at risk. Particularly if you live in Missouri, Maine, North Dakota, Nevada, or Montana, definitely let us know because we have some special things going on there. So what I'm going to do is going to give you opportunity to fill in this survey that we have right here. Please fill this out. Let us know if you want to get more information about any of these, and in about a minute, we'll start the question. So feel free to submit your results. You can pick any, one or all three, or all five. Thank you. I'm going to give everyone about 30 more seconds. About 15 more. All right, thank you. All right, so at this point, we are going to now skip ahead to our question and answer session. I think one of the common questions that I see, and obviously for anyone that wants to jump in, feel free to answer. But I think one of the largest questions we have, or one question that we see most often is kind of what is your best response to people who say that science is not political? Would anybody like to take that question first? How is science, or what would you say, or how would you respond to people who say that science is not political?
This is Yvette Arellano, not a scientist, but I would say that scientists, that question would have been better, and the better phrasing for that for someone who asked that is science political or partisan? And I would say science doesn't have to be partisan, but it is political because the lives of people at stake, our lives have been politicized from the beginning.
Okay. And this is Navina from HEAL, and I would just, like everything that Yvette just said, and I would just add that, again, getting to like what gets studied and what doesn't get studied, like that absolutely is political, and that's what helps shape what our culture thinks is important, and what kinds of policies we can advocate for, what kind of community change that we can make. And it's in the ways that we go about doing science, so the way that research gets done, whether it's with communities or not, and it's in what actually gets studied, put forward, what kind of data is being addressed, and what isn't, who's always left out of those studies, and whose issues rise to the surface.
For me, to be anyone that would allow science to be used to speak to, to support that it's okay for a certain population to be at risk, is and continues to be a problem for me. And with that is, I agree with both. That is politicized, and it just sound right, wrong, and needs to be changed. That's one of the huge narratives that we really need to be changed, that it allows certain populations to be at risk, and that science is used to support and uphold that.
Thank you, guys. The next question, which is once again an amalgamation of a couple of different questions. how would you suggest integrating social justice and also indigenous lessons into education, both on the high school and also the college level? A lot of people are from an academic background and are not quite sure how to integrate this into whether it's their curriculum or within what their departments are focusing on anyway.
This is Yvette. I would say to stop framing the indigenous history as history because it is ongoing. In fact, there was a long conversation that we've had with our partners in the indigenous community to say they still exist. They still exist, so stop framing it as these people of the past, is not a good way to go about it. And talking about, the political sense and how history and policy have shaped some of these communities could be an easy way to start talking about, well, what are the violations of the Voting Rights Act? Where have they historically been? Where is gerrymandering being used, So that's something that the Double Jeopardy report does. It offers a landscape of the political environment in order to help understand why is it that you have vulnerable and marginalized populations.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that just bringing humans in to science is important. I think one of the mistakes that gets made often is assuming that natural sciences are objective, right? And we're talking right now about whether they're political or not, but that it's objective or that it's somehow separate from human relationship. And so whether it's studying the interaction between two plant species and, like was just said, bringing in indigenous knowledge around how people have historically related to that can be brought into the classroom to bring in some aspects of culture to that. Or when we're talking about climate change and not just limiting it to parts per million in the atmosphere, but looking at what are actually the impacts of climate chaos right now on communities. In the classroom, you can talk about the weather patterns that are happening, climate chaos, and access to resources or to aid and how it's impacting frontline communities at the same time. So just bringing in the human element to and the actual impacts into anything, as well as bringing in, like I mentioned before, people from communities who can actually speak to the impacts and what's needed as guest lecturers or going on a field trip to the community organizations that are implementing practices are ways to bring that in.
In a couple of our communities, along with the CSD program, we've been working with young people in developing curriculum together along with the young people. And in one case, worked on a coloring book together, and we're still working on that coloring book together, where we're providing like educational series on it, and then the young folks come together with like a thematic character and piece, if you will, like, for example, that speaks to the issue of climate change and their narrative that they pulled from that and in that of our learning experiences together. And there's been elders in that space as well, speaking to what Yvette was saying, how all of our cultures continue to move on, that we must be able to continue to move that narrative on, and what better way, because we're all learning together. And so that's how we've been incorporating some of that work in our spaces. And in addition to, in the Who's in Danger report, was able to really, like you said, Yvette, draw that timeline back to looking at the historical narratives on how our communities have been impacted and the policies that impacted them, to be able to provide that social science-based narrative to that of the science, to understand why we need to, again, go back to this piece, remove that thought in our psyche that it is okay for a certain population or populations for cultures to be at risk.
All right, thank you. Last question. I'm actually going to try to combine two in order for the sake of time. Can you talk about how you talk about social justice, how you implement social justice in places, A, where, the harm and impacts are less obvious and direct to people, such as like nuclear weapons, or where just institutional support isn't there for the people trying to implement it? If you all could try for that.
So being in Texas, in Houston, there is little to no local or state support. So what we continuously try and do is bring resources from outside of this political environment from areas that are much more progressive in order to help us with research, with dissemination, with workshops, with getting our message out there. It's about from our standpoint, it's for getting the message out there, out into the East Coast and the West Coast, where you've been able to get rid of offshore oil drilling, whereas in the Gulf Coast it is still heavily impacted, right? And being able to talk about racism in an open way. People are constantly pushing away, speaking openly about racism and continued racism. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just add to that, it is a long, slow process, and what we need more than ever right now is folks, especially in places where people aren't talking about social justice or racial justice, to be bringing that up. And there will be hard conversations along the way. You'll have to push a lot. But remembering that having those conversations, even when they're uncomfortable, are really important, and pushing your own research as well as the work of others to include that is critical.
We in the Environmental Justice Health Alliance are part of a larger collective called the Coming Clean. And so, again, in the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, there are approximately 30 groups in 13 states, to which TEJAS is one, that has advocacy groups also in addition to the supportive element of that piece. And we're working with larger groups like UCS, Natural Resource Defense Council, and others, but not just working with them, also building relations. So what I mean by that is the leadership of EJHA has been building relations with UCS, NRDC, and others, thereby creating memorandums of agreement and providing that of the technical research, resource, capacity building support that is necessary for groups who may not be able to push that on the, like Yvette was saying, there in the Gulf Coast. In addition to that, where we have membership from EJHA and Appalachia, and on the East Coast is where the chemical management is pushed through along in the banking infrastructure. So we're in those egregious spaces where we need those active partners, but those partners with principled integrity. And so therefore the relations are built on that of principles like the environmental justice principles, the HEMIS principles for democratic organizing, creating memorandums of agreement where we need with our bodies of work, and therefore that is providing the principled integrity foundation that we need to build our relations through. And that is how you begin to really change the narrative, because at that point you're all doing that amongst one another with respect to your principled just relations.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Navina, Yvette, and Michele for spending time with us. And as well, thank you, Shreya, Melissa, Danielle, Juan, and Amelia and Sharif for working behind the scenes. And thank all of you for attending. I'll be sending a follow-up email next week with this recording of the webinar, as well as links to the resources provided. So we know this webinar is just a continuation of a larger discussion about science and social justice currently happening, but we look forward to continuing that conversation with all of you. Have a great rest of the day, everyone, and go out there and do some good. Thank you.